Caleb Mercer had 30 days to find a wife or lose everything he'd bled for. 6 years of brutal Arizona sun, rattlesnakes in his bedroll, and neighbors who'd sooner shoot him than shake his hand. All of it would belong to the bank if he didn't produce a marriage certificate by month's end. The land grant required it. The law demanded it. And when Eleanor Graves stepped off the afternoon stage with her Eastern manners and unreadable eyes, Caleb saw her for exactly what she was, a stranger who might save his ranch, or the final mistake that would destroy it. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this story, please hit the like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels. Now, let's see if a desperate rancher and a guarded woman can turn a legal arrangement into something worth fighting for. The dust rose in copper clouds as Caleb Mercer drove the fence post deeper into the Arizona hardpan, each strike of the mallet sending shockwaves through his shoulders. Sweat carved clean lines down his sun-darkened face, and his hands, scarred from 6 years of wrestling this unforgiving land into submission, gripped the wooden handle with the kind of desperation that came from knowing time was running out. 30 days. The words had been echoing in his skull for 2 weeks now, ever since Abraham Thornwell from the Territorial Land Office had ridden out with that damned envelope. The letter inside had been perfectly civil, almost apologetic, as it explained that homestead grants in the Arizona Territory required married settlers to prove permanent establishment and family intention. Single men were considered transient, unreliable, not worthy of ownership. Caleb had built this ranch from nothing. Every fence line, every water trough, every building had come from his hands and his will. He'd survived Apache raids that sent other settlers running back east. He'd outlasted droughts that killed cattle by the hundreds. He'd even taken a bullet in the shoulder from rustlers and kept working the next day, one arm in a sling, the other wielding a branding iron. And now some bureaucrat in a comfortable office was telling him it all meant nothing without a wife. The mallet came down harder, the post finally settling solid. Caleb straightened, pressing his fist against the small of his back where the ache never quite left anymore. 32 years old, and he already moved like a man twice that age. The land took its payment in installments, a piece of your body, a piece of your soul, until you couldn't remember what you'd been before it claimed you. "Boss!" The shout came from the direction of the main house, where Miguel Santos was waving from the porch. Caleb's foreman had been with him since the beginning, a compact Mexican man with steady hands and steadier judgment. If Miguel was calling him in, it meant something needed immediate attention. Caleb grabbed his hat from where it hung on the fence post, settled it low over his eyes against the afternoon glare, and started the walk back. The ranch spread out around him in all directions, 400 acres of scrubland that he'd somehow coaxed into productivity. Cattle grazed in the distance, their red hides stark against the pale grass. The barn stood solid, its wood weathered, but sound. The bunkhouse he'd built last year showed clean lines, good craftsmanship. All of it about to slip through his fingers because he didn't have the right signature on the right piece of paper. "What is it?" Caleb asked as he reached the porch, not breaking stride toward the house. Miguel fell into step beside him, his expression carefully neutral. Stage came in. "You got a visitor." Caleb stopped. "I'm not expecting anyone." "I know." Miguel's tone carried something Caleb couldn't quite identify. Amusement, maybe? Or concern? "Woman says she's here about the advertisement." The advertisement. Those two words hit Caleb like cold water. He'd placed that ad 3 weeks ago, after the first shock of Thornwell's ultimatum had worn off and the reality of his situation had settled in. It had been humiliating, writing out the words, "Rancher seeks wife. Must be of good character and sound health. Practical arrangement, honest terms. Reply to C. Mercer, Cibola, Arizona Territory." He'd sent it to newspapers in St. Louis, Chicago, and Boston, figuring if he had to do this, he'd cast a wide net. He'd expected letters, maybe. Inquiries he could sift through, candidates he could interview by mail and select at a safe distance. He hadn't expected someone to simply show up. "Where is she?" he asked. "Parlor. I gave her water." Miguel paused. "She's not what you'd expect." Caleb shot him a look. "What does that mean?" "It means you should see for yourself." The house was cooler inside, the thick adobe walls keeping out the worst of the heat. Caleb had built it small but solid, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a parlor that served as office and meeting room, functional, nothing wasted on comfort or decoration. The kind of house a man alone would build. He could see her through the doorway before he entered, and Miguel was right. She wasn't what he'd expected. Eleanor Graves sat perfectly upright in the wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap, her gray dress buttoned to her throat despite the heat. Dark hair pulled back severe from a face that was all angles, sharp cheekbones, a straight nose, a mouth set in a line that suggested she didn't smile easily. But it was her eyes that caught him, gray-blue, like storm clouds over the mountains, and they tracked his movement with an intensity that made him feel cataloged, assessed, and judged in the space of 3 seconds. Mr. Mercer. She didn't stand, didn't offer her hand, just spoke his name like a statement of fact. Miss... He realized he didn't know what to call her. Graves. Eleanor Graves. She gestured to the chair across from her. You should sit. We have business to discuss, and I imagine you're tired. The presumption of it, telling him to sit in his own house, should have irritated him. Instead, he found himself taking the chair, suddenly aware of the dust on his clothes, the smell of sweat and horse that clung to him. She looked like she'd stepped out of a Boston drawing room despite the long journey. Composed, controlled, completely out of place. You came about the advertisement, he said, making it a statement rather than a question. I did. She reached into a small bag at her feet and produced a folded newspaper, creased from travel. Though I should tell you immediately that I have questions before I commit to anything. Questions. Caleb leaned back, studying her. Most women would have written first. Most women would have required promises you couldn't keep. Her gaze didn't waver. I prefer to see what I'm considering before making decisions that can't be unmade. There was something almost aggressive about her directness, a challenge in the set of her shoulders. Caleb had expected someone desperate, a widow with no prospects maybe, or an older woman looking for security. Eleanor Graves looked young, maybe 26 or 7, and she carried herself like someone used to making her own choices. Why would you answer an ad like that, he asked. Woman like you could find a husband easy enough back east. Something flickered across her face, gone too quickly to identify. What I could or couldn't find in Philadelphia is irrelevant. What matters is what you're offering here, and whether it's worth my consideration. Philadelphia. Educated, then. Probably for money, judging by the quality of her dress, the cultured clip of her words, which raised more questions than it answered. What did the ad tell you? Caleb asked. That you're desperate. No hesitation, no softening of the blow. A man doesn't advertise for a wife unless he's out of options. The question is why? He could have lied. Should have lied, probably, but something about those storm cloud eyes suggested she'd see through it immediately, and he was too tired for games. Land grant requires a married man. I've got 30 days to produce a wife, or I lose the ranch. He watched her face for reaction, saw none. That direct enough for you? Extremely. She nodded, as if he'd confirmed something she already suspected. So you need a marriage certificate, not a marriage. A solution to a legal problem. That's one way to put it. It's the honest way. Eleanor shifted slightly, the first real movement since he'd entered the room. Which brings me to my first question. What exactly are you proposing? Caleb spread his hands. A legal marriage. You'd have your own room, your own space. I'm not looking for... He paused, uncomfortable. This would be a business arrangement, practical. I need the paperwork, you'd need security, fair exchange. Fair for whom? The question came sharp. You get your land. What do I get besides a roof and a title? The bluntness of it caught him off guard. Most women would have danced around the subject, relied on implications and social niceties. Eleanor just laid it out plain, like negotiating a cattle sale. Room, board, protection, he said. A share of the ranch's profits, legal rights to everything I've built. Legal rights you could revoke at any time. She tilted her head slightly. I wasn't born yesterday, Mr. Mercer. A wife's legal rights in the territories are barely better than a child's. If you decided to withdraw support, I'd have no recourse. I wouldn't. How would I know that? She cut him off, but without heat. Simple logic. You're a stranger who placed an advertisement. For all I know, you could be violent, dishonest, or simply incompetent at managing this ranch you're so desperate to keep. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. You came all this way to insult me? I came all this way to find out if you're worth the risk. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, and he caught a faint scent of lavender, incongruous in this rough room. I won't lie to you, Mr. Mercer. I need to leave Philadelphia. I have my reasons, and they're mine to keep. But I'm not desperate enough to walk into a situation blind. So here's what I propose. 1 week. 1 week? A trial period. I'll stay here for 7 days. In that time, I'll evaluate the ranch, your character, and whether this arrangement could possibly work. You'll do the same for me. At the end of the week, we both decide, honestly, if we can tolerate this for the sake of mutual benefit. The audacity of it should have angered him. Instead, Caleb found himself considering it. She was right about one thing. They were strangers. He'd been so focused on the deadline, on solving the problem, that he hadn't thought about what happened after the ceremony, about whether he could actually live with whoever showed up. And if one of us says no, he asked, then I return east, you try another option, and we part ways with no obligations. She sat back again, watching him. But if we both agree we do this properly, a real marriage, legally binding, with terms we both understand and accept. What kind of terms? Honesty, dignity, and partnership. Eleanor's voice carried weight on that last word. I won't be decoration, Mr. Mercer. I won't sit quietly in a corner while you make decisions about my life. If I'm going to bind myself legally to you and this ranch, I'll have a voice in how it's run. I've been running this place for 6 years without help, Caleb said, hearing the edge in his own voice. And it's brought you to the edge of losing everything. No mercy in her tone. Perhaps a different perspective might serve you better. They stared at each other across the small table, the air between them charged with challenge. Outside, Caleb could hear Miguel giving orders to the ranch hands, the normal sounds of work continuing. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking seconds neither of them could afford to waste. 1 week, he finally said, but I've got work to do. I can't spend the time giving tours and making conversation. I don't require entertainment, Mr. Mercer. I require access. Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirt. I'll need to see your financial records, your operational schedules, your inventory. I'll need to understand what I'd be committing to. You know ranching? I know business. I kept my father's books for 8 years before he died. She met his eyes squarely. Numbers don't change much between industries. Profit, loss, waste, efficiency, the principles remain the same. Caleb rose as well, suddenly aware that despite her reserved manner, Eleanor Graves was taller than most women he'd met, her eyes nearly level with his own. Records are in the desk. Help yourself. I will. But first, where will I be staying? He hadn't thought that far ahead. The second bedroom was currently storing equipment and spare tack. I'll have Miguel clear out the spare room. Should be ready by tonight. Thank you. She moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing, Mr. Mercer. During this week, we speak plainly to each other. No polite lies, no dancing around difficult subjects. If this has any chance of working, it will be because we're both willing to be honest, even when it's uncomfortable. I can do honest, Caleb said. Good. Eleanor's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. Then honestly, you should bathe before dinner. You smell like cattle. She was gone before he could respond, her footsteps measured and calm as she crossed the porch. Through the window, Caleb watched her survey the ranch yard with that same assessing gaze she'd turned on him, calculating, measuring, judging. Miguel appeared in the doorway, eyebrows raised in question. Well? The foreman asked. She wants a trial week. Caleb moved to the window, tracking Eleanor's progress toward the barn. 7 days to decide if we can stand each other. And you agreed? You got a better idea? Caleb pulled off his hat, running a hand through sweat-dampened hair. She's educated, sharp, probably sharper than me. That doesn't take much, Miguel said, then raised his hands at Caleb's glare. I'm saying she's got a head on her shoulders. Might not be a bad thing. Might be a disaster. But even as he said it, Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Not hope exactly, more like curiosity. Clear out the spare room, and Miguel, tell the men to watch their language. We've got a lady on the place now. Miguel's grin was knowing. A lady who tells the boss he smells. I like her already. The records were a disaster. Eleanor had expected rough bookkeeping. Frontier ranches weren't known for meticulous accounting. But what she found in Caleb Mercer's desk drawer went beyond rough into the realm of negligent. Receipts mixed with bills, income noted on scraps of paper, expenses estimated rather than tracked. It would take her hours just to sort through the chaos, let alone make sense of the actual financial picture. She'd been given a small bedroom that smelled of leather and saddle soap, clearly hastily cleared of equipment, a bed with clean sheets, a washstand, a single window that looked out over the corral. Spartan, but functional. Like everything else about this place. Eleanor sat at the small desk Caleb used as an office, spreading papers across its surface in some semblance of organization. Outside, she could hear men's voices, the sound of horses, the daily rhythm of ranch work. So different from the city she'd left behind, where sounds meant carriages and vendors and the constant press of humanity. She'd told Caleb she had her reasons for leaving Philadelphia. What she hadn't said was how final that departure had been. Her father's business partner had made his intentions clear 3 months after the funeral. Jonathan Aldridge, respectable and prosperous, with a wife barely cold in her grave and an eye toward consolidating his holdings. Marriage to Eleanor would give him control of her father's share of the company. He'd presented it as a practical solution, just as Caleb had presented this arrangement. But Eleanor had seen the way Aldridge looked at her, had heard the edge in his voice when she'd questioned his accounting discrepancies. She'd discovered the embezzlement 2 weeks later, years of careful theft, disguised in the complicated books she'd once been banned from examining too closely. When she'd confronted him, he'd smiled, told her no one would believe a grieving daughter over an established businessman, told her that marriage would make the whole ugly business disappear, would give her the protection she clearly needed as a woman alone. She'd left Philadelphia the next day. The newspaper advertisement had been folded in her traveling bag for 2 weeks before she'd worked up the courage to answer it. A rancher in Arizona Territory, desperately seeking a wife. It had seemed almost laughable at first, swapping one legal trap for another. But at least Caleb Mercer was honest about what he wanted. At least here, she could see the trap before walking into it. A knock on the doorframe pulled her from her thoughts. Miguel stood there, hat in hand, his weathered face friendly. "Señora, dinner will be ready soon. The boss thought you might like to know." "Thank you, Miguel." Eleanor gestured to the papers. "Do you know anything about these records?" He stepped into the room, careful and respectful of the space. "I know the boss is better with cattle than numbers. What he makes, he puts back into the ranch. What's left, he saves. It's simple." "Too simple," Eleanor murmured, picking up a receipt dated 8 months ago. "He paid twice the going rate for this fence wire." Miguel frowned, moving closer to look. "That was from Hendrick's store in town. Only supplier. Only supplier who's overcharging." She set the receipt aside, made a note. "What about this feed purchase? $300 for winter hay?" "The cattle needed it. We had a hard winter last year." Eleanor pulled out another paper. "But here's a notation that half the hay molded before use. That's $150 wasted." Miguel's expression darkened. The boss didn't mention that. Because he probably didn't track it properly. "Miguel, who manages the supplies? Who checks what comes in against what was ordered?" "Different men, depending on the job. The boss trusts people to be honest." "Trust is admirable. Verification is smarter." Eleanor began making a list, her pen moving quickly across fresh paper. "I'll need to speak with your suppliers, and I'll need an accurate inventory of everything on this ranch. Cattle, equipment, supplies, all of it." "That's a big job, Señora. I have a week." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "And I don't intend to waste it." Dinner was beef stew, fresh bread, and strong coffee. The men ate in the bunkhouse, but Miguel had set 3 places at the kitchen table: himself, Caleb, and Eleanor. The room was quiet except for the clink of spoons against bowls, the crackle of the fire in the stove. Caleb had bathed, Eleanor noted. His hair was damp, his face clean-shaven, and he wore a shirt that wasn't covered in dust. The effort was noted, if not commented upon. "Your records are inadequate," she said, breaking the silence. Caleb's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "Direct enough for you?" You asked for honesty. Eleanor set down her own spoon, folding her hands in her lap. You're being robbed, Mr. Mercer. Not violently, but systematically. Overcharged on supplies, sold inferior goods at premium prices, and you're not tracking anything carefully enough to notice. I track what matters: the cattle, the land, the water. And who tracks the money that keeps all of that running? She leaned forward slightly. I found 6 different instances in the last year alone where you paid significantly more than market rate for basic supplies. Your feed costs are nearly double what they should be, and you're not recording losses properly, which means you can't identify patterns or prevent future waste. Miguel cleared his throat. The Senora makes good points, boss. The Senora, Caleb said, his tone careful, has been here less than a day, which means I can see problems you've grown used to ignoring. Eleanor didn't back down. You've built something impressive here, Mr. Mercer, but you're losing money to incompetence and dishonesty, and that's just as dangerous as drought or disease. Caleb set down his spoon, giving her his full attention. You said you needed to evaluate the ranch. Sounds like you've already made up your mind it's a mess. It's not a mess. It's poorly managed in specific areas. Bese, she matched his direct gaze. The infrastructure is solid. The land is good. Your foreman is competent and loyal. Your cattle are healthy. But your business practices are costing you thousands of dollars a year, and if that continues, it won't matter how good the rest of it is. And you think you can fix it? I know I can. The question is whether you'll let me. The challenge hung between them, neither looking away. Miguel made himself very interested in his stew, staying carefully out of the crossfire. Finally, Caleb spoke. What would you need? Access to everything: suppliers, accounts, inventory. Authority to make changes where necessary. Eleanor paused. And your agreement not to countermand my decisions without discussion. That's asking a lot. You're asking me to bind my entire future to this place. I'm asking you to let me help save it. She picked up her spoon again, her voice calm. If I'm going to risk everything on this arrangement, Mr. Mercer, I need to know it's not built on sand. Caleb looked at Miguel, who carefully avoided his eyes, then back at Eleanor. 1 week. You do what you think needs doing, and I'll try not to interfere. But this is still my ranch. I'm aware. Eleanor returned to her stew. I'm not trying to take it from you. I'm trying to make sure you get to keep it. Tim. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity that left the ranch hands bewildered, and Miguel quietly amused. Eleanor rose before dawn, appearing in the kitchen as Caleb made his morning coffee. She didn't ask permission, just poured herself a cup and followed him out to the morning planning session with the crew. She listened to the work assignments, took notes, and asked questions that made men shuffle their feet and reconsider answers. By noon of the first day, she'd reorganized the supply shed, discovered 3 broken tools that should have been replaced months ago, and identified a pattern of missing equipment that suggested either theft or catastrophic carelessness. By evening, she'd ridden into town with Miguel, riding astride to Caleb's surprise, her Eastern dress exchanged for a practical split skirt, and returned with a ledger book and a grim expression. Hendricks has been overcharging you for 3 years, she announced at dinner, dropping receipts on the table. I spoke with 2 other ranchers. Your prices are 30% higher across the board. Caleb picked up the papers, his jaw tightening as he read. Son of a... I've already spoken with the supplier in Silver City. He'll match competitive prices and deliver weekly. Eleanor sat down, accepting the coffee Miguel poured. You'll save approximately $800 annually on basic supplies alone. You did this in 1 day? I did this in 4 hours. The rest of the afternoon was spent evaluating your cattle records. She pulled out another set of notes. You're not tracking birthing rates accurately, which means you don't know your actual herd growth. You're also not documenting cattle deaths in a way that would let you identify if there's a health pattern or predation issue. Caleb felt something between irritation and admiration stirring in his chest. Anything else? Your fencing in the north pasture is failing. You've got at least a quarter mile that needs immediate replacement, or you'll lose cattle to wandering. She met his eyes. But you already knew that, didn't you? You just haven't had time to address it. He had known. Had been putting it off for weeks, trying to handle everything himself because hired help cost money and trust was in short supply. I'll get to it, he said. We'll get to it. Eleanor's correction was gentle but firm. That's the point of partnership, Mr. Mercer. Shared burdens. By the end of day 4, Eleanor had transformed the ranch's record-keeping system, identified and stopped 3 separate sources of financial bleeding, and earned the grudging respect of every man on the property. She also earned their wariness. Caleb found her in the barn on the 5th morning, standing in front of the feed bins with her arms crossed and her expression dangerous. "We need to talk," she said. He'd learned that tone meant trouble. About? About the fact that someone's been stealing from you. She gestured to the bins. These should be half full based on your purchase records. They're nearly empty. Caleb moved closer, checking the levels himself. She was right. Could be the cattle are eating more than usual. The cattle are eating exactly what they should be. I've been tracking it. Eleanor's voice carried certainty. Someone's taking feed and selling it elsewhere. Probably the same someone who's been losing equipment and tools. The implications settled over Caleb like a cold weight. You're saying one of my men is a thief. I'm saying someone with access to your supplies is systematically stealing from you, and they've been doing it long enough to get comfortable. She turned to face him fully. You need to find out who before this weekend's, because if we go forward with this arrangement, I won't tolerate theft. Neither will I. Caleb felt anger kindle in his chest, the kind that came from betrayal. He'd trusted these men, worked beside them, paid them fairly. I'll handle it. We'll handle it. Eleanor touched his arm briefly, the contact surprising them both. You hired them, you trust them. But I'm the one who sees the patterns in the numbers. We need both perspectives. The word "we" sent something strange through Caleb's chest. He'd been alone for so long, making every decision, carrying every burden. The idea of sharing it felt foreign and frightening and oddly appealing. All right, he said. We'll handle it together. They set the trap on day 6. Eleanor documented the current supply levels carefully, then she and Caleb made a show of riding into town for a personal matter, leaving Miguel in charge. They doubled back within an hour, approaching the ranch from the blind side of the barn. What they found confirmed Eleanor's suspicions. Tom Bradshaw, one of the ranch hands Caleb had hired 8 months ago, was loading feed sacks onto a wagon. Not the ranch wagon, a private rig that belonged to someone else. He worked quickly, efficiently, the movements of someone who'd done this many times before. Caleb stepped into the barn, Eleanor behind him. That's enough, Tom. Bradshaw spun, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. Then he saw Eleanor and froze, trapped between violence and calculation. Easy, Caleb said, his voice level despite the fury in his eyes. Don't make this worse than it already is. Boss, I can explain. Don't. The word cut like a knife. You've been stealing from me for months. Eleanor found the pattern in about 3 days. So unless your explanation involves a complete accounting of everything you've taken and where it went, I don't want to hear it. Bradshaw's face hardened. You going to believe some Eastern woman over a man who's worked for you? I'm going to believe the numbers. Caleb moved closer, his presence suddenly dangerous. And I'm going to believe my own eyes. You're done here, Tom. You've got 10 minutes to clear out your bunk and get off my land. You can't just... I can. And if you're not gone in 10 minutes, I'm riding into town for the sheriff and pressing charges. Caleb's voice dropped lower. Your choice how this ends. Bradshaw looked between them, saw no mercy in either face, and made his decision. He dropped the feed sack, spat in the dirt, and stalked toward the bunkhouse without another word. Eleanor released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. That could have gone badly. It did go badly. I've got a thief on my ranch and didn't know it. Caleb's voice carried self-recrimination. You found it in less than a week. What does that say about me? It says you're good at building ranches and bad at watching your back. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice softening. And it says you need someone who can see what you're too busy to notice. He looked at her then, really looked. 5 days ago, she'd been a stranger stepping off a stage. Now she stood in his barn, dust on her skirt and determination in her eyes, having just helped him root out a problem that could have destroyed everything he'd built. The week's almost over, he said quietly. It is. Eleanor didn't look away. Have you made your decision? Caleb thought about the last 5 days, about Eleanor transforming his chaotic records into organized systems, saving him hundreds of dollars, catching a thief he'd trusted, about the way she'd insisted on partnership rather than submission, on honesty rather than comfortable lies, about the fact that when she'd touched his arm in the barn earlier, it had been the first gentle contact he'd had with another person in longer than he could remember. "Yeah," he said, "I've made my decision. Question is, have you?" Eleanor smiled then, a real smile that transformed her stern features into something almost beautiful. "Ask me properly, Mr. Mercer. If we're going to do this, we do it right." He almost laughed at the audacity of it. Here, in a barn that smelled of hay and horse, with a fired ranch hand probably cursing them both from the bunkhouse. But Eleanor was right. If they were going to bind their lives together, even for practical reasons, it deserved more than a casual agreement. Caleb removed his hat, holding it in both hands. "Miss Graves, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? It won't be easy, and it won't be romantic, but I'll be honest with you, and I'll share what I have, and I'll try like hell to be worthy of the partnership you're offering." Eleanor's eyes shimmered with something that might have been tears, though her voice remained steady. "Mr. Mercer, I accept. On the condition that you stop trying to do everything alone, that you trust me to carry my share, and that you remember I'm not here to save you, I'm here to stand beside you." "Deal," Caleb said, and extended his hand. Eleanor took it, her grip firm and sure. They shook once, formally, sealing an agreement that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival, trust, and the strange courage it took to choose someone when you had every reason to stay alone. Miguel appeared in the barn doorway, took in the scene, and grinned. "So, do I start planning a wedding?" "You do," Caleb said, not releasing Eleanor's hand. "Small ceremony, next week, before the deadline." "And after," Eleanor added, her voice carrying a hint of the steel that had made her cross a continent for a stranger's advertisement. "We have a ranch to run properly." As they walked back to the house together, Caleb felt the weight of the last 6 years shift slightly. Still heavy, still demanding, but no longer quite so impossible to carry alone. He had 23 days left to meet the deadline, and for the first time since Thornwell had delivered that damned letter, Caleb Mercer believed he might actually make it. Not because he'd found someone to save him, but because he'd found someone willing to fight beside him. The wedding took place on a Thursday morning, 6 days before the deadline, in the small church at the edge of Cibola, where dust motes danced in slanted sunlight, and the Reverend spoke the binding words with efficient kindness. Eleanor wore a simple dress of deep blue that she'd purchased in town the day before, her dark hair pinned up beneath a hat that actually belonged to Miguel's wife. Caleb had traded his work clothes for a clean shirt and vest, his boots polished for the first time in recent memory. Miguel stood as witness, along with Sarah Chen, the Chinese woman who ran the boarding house and had befriended Eleanor during her brief time in town. The ceremony lasted 12 minutes. When the Reverend pronounced them married, Caleb extended his hand for a formal shake. Eleanor took it, squeezed once, and released. No kiss, no embrace. Just a legal bond witnessed and recorded, signed into the territorial register with ink that dried black and permanent. "Congratulations," the Reverend said, though his eyes held questions he was too polite to voice. Eleanor signed her new name carefully, Eleanor Mercer, the letters strange and foreign beneath her pen. She'd given up Graves willingly, had left that name behind in Philadelphia, along with everything else she couldn't carry. But Mercer felt like borrowed clothes, something she was wearing but didn't quite own yet. They rode back to the ranch in the wagon, Miguel driving while Caleb and Eleanor sat in the back among supplies they'd picked up in town. The silence stretched comfortable enough, broken only by the creak of wheels and the steady clip of hooves on packed earth. "I'll file the certificate with Thornwell tomorrow," Caleb said finally. "Should satisfy the requirement." "Good." Eleanor watched the landscape roll past, all scrub and sky and impossible distances. "Then we can focus on actual work instead of bureaucratic nonsense." Miguel glanced back, smiling. "Most brides talk about their wedding day differently." "Most brides aren't, Eleanor," Caleb said, and there was something almost like warmth in his voice. Back at the ranch, there was no celebration, no special dinner, no acknowledgement that anything had fundamentally changed. Eleanor moved her few belongings from the spare room to what was now technically the master bedroom, though Caleb had already relocated himself to a bedroll in his office. "You don't have to sleep on the floor," Eleanor said, finding him arranging blankets on the hard wood. The bed is large enough for 2 people to sleep without— She paused, searching for appropriate phrasing. Without impropriety. Caleb straightened, his expression carefully neutral. Wouldn't be right? What wouldn't be right is you developing a permanent crook in your spine from sleeping on boards. Eleanor crossed her arms. We're adults, Mr. Mercer. We can share sleeping space without drama. I trust you to be a gentleman. It's not about trust, it's about— He stopped, frustrated. People will talk. People are already talking. We got married for a land grant with no courtship and no love match. The scandal is already established. She moved to the doorway. Sleep where you're comfortable, but don't suffer on my account. I'm not that delicate. She left him there, and Caleb stood in the small office staring at the bedroll and wondering how Eleanor Mercer had already made him question every assumption he had about how this arrangement would work. The next morning, he filed the marriage certificate with Abraham Thornwell, who examined the document with barely concealed surprise. Well, Thornwell said, stamping the official seal. You certainly didn't waste time, Mercer. Congratulations. Thank you. Caleb took the receipt, folded it carefully into his pocket. The ranch is secure now. Legally, yes. Thornwell leaned back in his chair, studying Caleb with the measured gaze of someone who'd seen too many desperate arrangements. But between us, son, a marriage certificate doesn't make a marriage. You've solved your immediate problem. The question is what you're going to do with the solution. Caleb had no answer for that, so he tipped his hat and left. When he returned to the ranch, he found Eleanor in the barn with 2 of the hands, examining the fence wire that had just been delivered from the new supplier in Silver City. She was dressed in practical clothes now, a split riding skirt, a simple blouse, her hair braided back in a way that made her look younger and somehow more formidable. This is what we ordered? She was asking, running her hand along the wire. Yes, ma'am, said Charlie, one of the older hands. Came in this morning. Eleanor nodded, making a note in the small book she now carried everywhere. Good. It's better quality than what Hendricks was selling, and it costs less. Make sure you document the difference when you install it. I want to track whether the durability matches the supplier's claims. You want us to write down how long fence wire lasts? Charlie sounded bewildered. I want you to note when sections fail or need repair. Yes. It's called quality control, Charlie. It helps us make better purchasing decisions. Eleanor looked up, saw Caleb watching from the barn entrance, and something shifted in her expression. Is it done? It's done. We're legal. He moved closer, aware of the hands pretending not to listen. Thornwell sends his congratulations. How generous of him. Eleanor closed her notebook. Charlie, get started on the north fence, and remember, document everything. The hand nodded and escaped, clearly relieved to return to work he understood. Eleanor waited until he was out of earshot before speaking again. How do you feel? She asked. The question surprised Caleb. No one had asked him that in years. Relieved, I guess. The ranch is safe. For now. Eleanor moved to check the feed bins, her movements efficient and purposeful. But we still have the underlying problems. The theft was a symptom, not the disease. Your operation has been bleeding money for years because you've been too busy surviving to notice. I noticed. I just didn't have time to fix everything. Caleb heard the defensive edge in his voice, tried to soften it. One man can only do so much. Good thing you're not one man anymore. Eleanor straightened, meeting his eyes. You have a wife now, Mr. Mercer. And while this marriage may be a business arrangement, I take my business seriously. Over the following weeks, Eleanor proved exactly how seriously she took it. She reorganized the entire ranch operation with the systematic precision of someone who'd spent years managing complex accounts. Every purchase required documentation. Every expense needed justification. Every loss was tracked and analyzed for patterns. The hands grumbled at first, unused to the additional paperwork, but they fell in line when they saw their paychecks arrive on time and in full, something that hadn't always happened in the leaner months. Eleanor also discovered that Caleb had been deferring his own salary to keep the ranch running, paying the men while taking nothing for himself beyond basic room and board. She found the pattern in the ledgers and confronted him over dinner. You can't keep doing this, she said, sliding the evidence across the table. You're working yourself to death for no compensation. The ranch is the compensation. building something that lasts. Caleb pushed food around his plate, uncomfortable with the scrutiny. Money comes later, when things are more stable. Things will never be stable if the owner is too exhausted to make good decisions. Eleanor's voice carried the kind of firm patience usually reserved for stubborn children. Starting next month, you take a salary, a real one, enough to live on. We do, actually. I've cut enough waste to cover it twice over. She pulled out another sheet of paper covered in her precise handwriting. Between the new supplier arrangements, the stop theft, and the improved inventory management, we're saving nearly $1,500 a year. That's enough for both of us to draw modest salaries and still build reserves. Caleb stared at the numbers, at the proof that Eleanor had already transformed his struggling operation into something approaching actual profitability. How did you do this so fast? I told you I know business. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. And I'm not afraid to ask difficult questions or make unpopular changes. You were too close to it, too attached to old patterns. Sometimes an outside perspective is exactly what's needed. That night, Caleb found himself thinking about Thornwell's words. A marriage certificate doesn't make a marriage. But what did? He and Eleanor shared a house, shared meals, shared the burden of running the ranch. She'd taken his name, bound her legal existence to his. They were partners in the truest sense, working toward common goals with honest communication and mutual respect. But they were also strangers, still learning each other's rhythms and boundaries. Eleanor had her own room, her own space, her own private corners that Caleb didn't intrude upon. They were cordial, professional, occasionally almost friendly. But there was a wall between them, invisible but solid, that neither seemed willing to breach. The crisis came 4 weeks after the wedding, on a cold morning when frost painted the scrubland white and the cattle huddled together for warmth. Miguel came running to the house before dawn, pounding on the door hard enough to wake both Caleb and Eleanor from their separate rooms. "Boss, we've got trouble!" Caleb was dressed and outside in seconds, Eleanor close behind in a hastily donned robe. "What is it?" "Rustlers hit the south pasture, took maybe 30 head, maybe more, trails fresh. Can't be more than 2 hours old." Miguel's face was grim in the lamplight. "They're headed toward the territorial line. 30 head. That was thousands of dollars in cattle, months of work, a significant chunk of their herd." Caleb felt fury rise hot and sharp in his chest. "Get the men mounted. We're going after them." He turned to go back inside for his gun, found Eleanor blocking his path. "How many rustlers?" she asked Miguel. "Tracks show maybe 4 or 5 riders. Hard to tell in the dark." Eleanor looked at Caleb, her expression calculating. "You're going to ride after 5 armed men with how many ranch hands?" "However many it takes." Caleb tried to move past her, but she didn't budge. "That's not a plan. That's suicide." Her voice cut sharp and clear through his anger. "You need to think, Mr. Mercer, not just react. They're stealing our cattle." "I'm aware. I'm also aware that you getting killed won't recover them." Eleanor grabbed his arm, forcing him to focus on her face instead of the rage pounding in his skull. "We need to be smart about this. Alert the sheriff, organize a proper posse, track them legally. By the time the sheriff gets organized, they'll be across the border and gone." Caleb pulled free, his voice rising. "I'm not letting them take what I've bled for without a fight." "No one's asking you to let it go. I'm asking you to not throw your life away on pride." Eleanor's composure cracked slightly, showing the fear beneath. "You want to ride into an ambush? Want to leave me here to explain to Thornwell why his carefully documented marriage ended with a dead husband?" The words hit harder than she probably intended. Caleb stopped, really hearing what she was saying beneath the practical objections. She was afraid. For him. "I'll be careful," he said, softer now. "Careful men don't chase armed rustlers in the dark." Eleanor released his arm but didn't step back. "Please, there has to be a better way." Miguel cleared his throat, reminding them both he was still there. "The Senora has a point, boss. We're ranchers, not gunfighters. Maybe we should—" The crack of gunfire split the pre-dawn air, distant but distinct. 3 shots in quick succession, then silence. Caleb's blood went cold. That came from the north pasture. They ran. The scene that greeted them was chaos rendered in lamplight and shadows. Two ranch hands stood over the body of another rustler, this one very much alive but clutching a bleeding shoulder. His horse was gone, disappeared into the darkness. And standing over him with a rifle still smoking was Eleanor. She'd dressed while they were talking, Caleb realized, pulled on riding clothes and boots, grabbed a rifle from the house, and gone to investigate on her own. "He was cutting fence," she said, her voice remarkably steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Going for the breeding stock. I ordered him to stop. He drew on me instead." Caleb moved to her side, gently taking the rifle from her grip before she could drop it. "You shot him." "I shot near him. The second shot was closer. The third convinced him to surrender." Eleanor's eyes were wide, but her jaw was set firm. "I may be from Philadelphia, Mr. Mercer, but my father believed in practical education. I know how to handle a firearm." The wounded rustler groaned, drawing Caleb's attention. He was young, maybe 20, with the desperate look of someone who'd made very bad choices for very bad reasons. "How many others?" Caleb demanded. "Go to hell," the rustler spat. Miguel arrived with rope, and they tied the wounded man securely. The bullet had torn through muscle, but missed bone. Painful, but not fatal. Eleanor had shot to wound, not kill. "We need to secure the rest of the herd," Eleanor said, all business now despite the shock that was probably settling into her bones. "If there are more rustlers, they might try again." She was right, of course. Caleb divided the hands into teams, some to track the stolen cattle, others to guard the remaining herd, one to ride for the sheriff in town. He wanted to lead the pursuit himself, but Eleanor's earlier words echoed in his mind. "You want to leave me here to explain to Thornwell why his carefully documented marriage ended with a dead husband?" "I'll stay," he said, the words tasting like surrender. "Coordinate from here. Make sure they don't circle back." Miguel nodded approval. "Smart thinking, boss. We'll track them, keep them moving, wait for the law to catch up." As the men dispersed to their tasks, Caleb found Eleanor sitting on a fence rail, staring at her hands. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving her pale and shaking. "You saved the breeding stock," he said quietly, moving to stand beside her. "That was brave. That was terrifying." Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. "I've never pointed a gun at another person before. I kept thinking, what if I missed? What if I actually killed him? But you didn't. You stayed calm, made good choices, protected what matters." Caleb reached out, hesitated, then gently took her hand. "Thank you." Eleanor looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. In the growing dawn light, he could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, held back by sheer force of will. "I couldn't let them take it," she said. "Not after everything we've worked for. Not after—" She stopped, seemed to reconsider her words. "This place matters. The work we're doing matters. I wasn't going to let some thieves undo it." The word "we" hit Caleb differently this time. Not a polite inclusion, but a genuine claim. Eleanor wasn't talking about his ranch that she happened to live on. She was talking about their ranch, their work, their shared investment in something larger than either of them alone. "It matters to me too," he said. "But not more than—" He paused, unsure how to finish the sentence. Not more than what? Not more than her? When had that shifted? When had Eleanor Mercer become something other than a legal convenience? The moment stretched between them, weighted with things neither knew how to articulate. Then Miguel's shout broke the silence, calling Caleb to deal with the captured rustler, and the moment passed. But something had changed. Caleb felt it as he walked away. Felt it in the way Eleanor's hand had gripped his before letting go. Felt it in the fierce protectiveness that had surged through him when he'd seen her standing over an armed man with a rifle in her hands. The sheriff arrived by mid-morning with a proper posse. The captured rustler sang like a bird once he understood the alternative was being left to answer to an angry rancher instead of proper law. The others were caught by evening. The stolen cattle recovered before they'd made it 20 miles. The whole incident cost the ranch 3 days of disrupted work, one wounded rustler who would face territorial justice, and several $1,000s in recovered livestock that might have been lost forever. It also cost Caleb his comfortable distance from his wife. That night, after the sheriff had left with his prisoners, and the hands had settled into exhausted sleep, Caleb found Eleanor in the barn checking on the horses. She'd been quiet all day, performing her duties with mechanical efficiency, but he could see the strain in the set of her shoulders. "You should rest," he said. "I should make sure everything is secure." Eleanor ran her hand along a horse's flank, not looking at him. Twice in one night would be impossible. The sheriff took them all. Caleb moved closer, keeping his voice gentle. "Eleanor, you can stop now. It's over." She turned then, and he saw that the iron control had finally cracked. Tears streaked her face, silent and unstoppable, and her hands shook as she tried to wipe them away. "I was so frightened," she whispered. "When I heard the fence cutting, when I realized what was happening, all I could think was that you were out there somewhere, maybe riding into a trap, maybe getting hurt, and I'd never even—" She stopped, pressing her fist against her mouth. Caleb closed the distance between them, acting on instinct rather than thought. He pulled her into his arms, feeling her resistance for just a moment before she collapsed against his chest, her careful composure finally shattering. "I know," he said into her hair, holding her while she shook. "I know." They stood like that for a long time, Eleanor crying quietly while Caleb held her steady, the barn dark and warm around them. When she finally pulled back, her face was blotchy, and her eyes were red, and Caleb thought she'd never looked more real. "I'm sorry," she said. "That was human." He kept his hands on her shoulders, anchoring her. "You held yourself together all day. You earned the right to fall apart a little." Eleanor managed a watery laugh. "Very practical of you, Mr. Mercer." "I'm learning from my wife. She's hell on practicality." He smiled, surprising himself. "Also hell on rustlers, apparently." That got a real laugh, stronger this time. Eleanor wiped her face with her sleeve, undignified and honest. "I can't believe I shot at someone." "I can't believe you moved the breeding stock to a secure location before confronting an armed thief." Caleb shook his head. "Most people would have run for help. Most people don't have $15,000 worth of cattle at stake." Eleanor straightened, finding her composure again. "Besides, running for help would have meant leaving you to ride into danger alone. I wasn't about to do that." The admission hung between them, more significant than she probably intended. Caleb studied her face in the lamplight, this sharp-eyed woman from Philadelphia who'd answered his desperate advertisement and proceeded to turn his entire world sideways. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why did you really come here, Eleanor? The truth." She could have deflected, could have maintained her privacy, her careful boundaries. Instead, she met his eyes squarely. "Because a man in Philadelphia wanted to marry me for my father's business, and when I discovered he'd been embezzling for years, he threatened me into compliance." The words came flat, matter of fact. He said no one would believe me, said marriage would make the problem disappear, would protect me from my own foolish accusations. Caleb felt anger kindle hot and immediate. "So, you ran." "So I chose differently." Eleanor's voice strengthened. "I chose a marriage where the terms were honest, where I had value beyond what I could bring to someone else's ambitions. I chose a partnership instead of ownership." She paused. "I chose you, Mr. Mercer, and I meant it when I said I wouldn't let anything undo what we're building." The weight of that choice settled over Caleb like a physical presence. She could have stayed in Philadelphia, could have found another solution, could have fought her battle there. Instead, she'd crossed a continent to bind her life to a stranger's, to invest her considerable skills in salvaging his desperate situation. And she'd done it knowing exactly what she was walking into. "I'm glad you did," he said. Choose here." Eleanor smiled, fragile but genuine. "So am I, most days. Even the days when you're shooting at rustlers. Especially those days. At least I know where I stand." She moved toward the barn entrance, paused in the doorway. "Are you coming? Or are you planning to sleep out here with the horses?" Caleb followed her into the cool night air, walking beside her toward the house they now shared in truth as well as law. Above them, stars scattered across the desert sky in impossible profusion, and somewhere in the darkness, the ranch they'd fought to protect settled into uneasy sleep. Inside, Eleanor paused at the hallway that split toward their separate rooms. "Caleb?" It was the first time she'd used his given name, and it sent something warm through his chest. "Yeah?" "Thank you. For staying today. for not riding off into something that could have gotten you killed. She hesitated. I know it cost you, choosing caution over action. It didn't cost me anything that matters. He met her eyes. The ranch is worth protecting, but not more than... He paused again, then committed to honesty. Not more than keeping my word to you, about partnership, about standing beside you instead of alone. Eleanor's expression softened into something that might have been affection. Good night, Mr. Mercer. Caleb, he corrected gently. If we're using first names now. Caleb, she repeated, testing the shape of it. Good night. She disappeared into her room, and Caleb stood in the hallway for a long moment, staring at her closed door and wondering when exactly his practical business arrangement had started feeling like something worth protecting for reasons that had nothing to do with land grants or legal requirements. In his office, he spread the bedroll on the floor as usual, then stopped. Looked at the thin blankets, the hard boards, the cramped space he'd been insisting was adequate. Eleanor's words came back to him. Don't suffer on my account. I'm not that delicate. He gathered the bedroll, walked quietly to the master bedroom, and eased open the door. The room was dark, but he could hear Eleanor's breathing, steady and calm. She was already asleep, or pretending to be, curled on her side of the large bed with plenty of space remaining. Caleb settled on the floor beside the bed, spreading his blankets there. Not in the bed, that felt like too much, too soon, but not in another room either, alone and separate. The floor is still uncomfortable, Eleanor's voice came soft from the darkness above. But it's a step in the right direction. Caleb smiled into the dark. Progress, then. Progress, she agreed. And as sleep pulled him under, Caleb thought about partnership, about choosing each other in small increments, about how sometimes the bravest thing wasn't facing down rustlers or fighting for land. Sometimes it was just allowing yourself to stop being alone. Winter came hard to the Arizona Territory that year, settling over the ranch like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. The first snow arrived in early November, light and tentative, melting by afternoon. But the storms that followed had teeth, bringing temperatures that turned water troughs to ice and winds that cut through layers of wool like they were paper. Caleb had weathered hard winters before, but never with so much at stake. The herd was larger now, more valuable, representing months of careful management and Eleanor's systematic improvements to their breeding program. Losing cattle to cold or starvation would undo everything they'd built since the wedding. He was checking the cattle in the north pasture when the sky changed, turning from pale gray to something darker and more ominous. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of snow and something else, something that made the horses nervous and the cattle restless. Miguel rode up beside him, his expression grim beneath his hat. Storm's coming, boss. A bad one. We need to move the herd to shelter. Caleb scanned the horizon, reading the weather with the instinct born of years on the land. Miguel was right. The storm building to the north wasn't the usual winter squall. It was something bigger, meaner, the kind that could kill cattle and men with equal indifference. Get everyone moving, Caleb ordered. Herd them toward the Box Canyon. We'll lose some stragglers, but we can't risk keeping them out here. The next 3 hours were a blur of shouting men, frightened cattle, and deteriorating conditions. The snow started as the first cattle entered the canyon, light at first, then building rapidly into sheets of white that reduced visibility to almost nothing. The temperature plummeted, and the wind rose to a howl that drowned out everything else. Caleb worked alongside his men, pushing stragglers towards safety, his face raw from wind and ice. He'd sent word to the ranch house hours ago, telling Eleanor to prepare for the men to shelter there if needed. Now he could barely see 10 feet ahead, could barely feel his hands inside his gloves, and the cold was seeping through his coat like water through cloth. Boss! Charlie's voice cut through the storm, urgent and afraid. We got cattle breaking south, maybe 20 head. 20 head. That was $2,000 running blind into a blizzard, and if they didn't turn them now, they'd scatter across miles of open territory where the storm would kill them. I'll get them, Caleb shouted back. You keep the main herd moving. Boss, you can't go alone in this. But Caleb was already riding, pushing his horse into the teeth of the storm, following the dark shapes of panicked cattle disappearing into the white. Behind him, he heard Miguel shouting orders. heard the fading sounds of the herd being driven to safety. Then there was just the wind, the snow, and the desperate attempt to save what could still be saved. He caught up to the stragglers a half-mile out, managed to turn the lead steer, got the small group moving back the right direction. The cold was brutal now, stealing feeling from his extremities, making every movement sluggish and difficult. His horse stumbled in a hidden drift, recovered, stumbled again. Caleb knew the signs. They were both exhausted, both freezing, and the storm was getting worse instead of better. He should turn back, should save himself and the horse, and let the cattle go. 20 head wasn't worth dying for, but they were his cattle, his responsibility, and some stubborn part of him refused to surrender anything else to this unforgiving land. He drove them forward, using his horse to block and turn, using his voice, even though the wind tore the words away. The cattle moved in fits and starts, confused and frightened, but slowly, painfully, he got them pointed toward the canyon. That's when his horse went down. The animal simply collapsed, too cold and too tired to continue. Caleb managed to kick free of the stirrups as they fell, hitting the frozen ground hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. His hat went flying into the storm. The cattle, sensing the loss of guidance, scattered again into the white. Caleb tried to stand, found his legs wouldn't support him properly. The cold had sunk deeper than he'd realized, and the fall had done something to his ribs that sent sharp pain through his chest with every breath. His horse struggled upright, shaking, but when Caleb reached for the reins, the animal shied away, spooked and disoriented. "Easy," Caleb called, but his voice came out weak, barely audible even to himself. "Easy, boy." The horse took 3 steps back, then turned and disappeared into the storm, following some instinct toward shelter that Caleb no longer had the strength to pursue. He was alone. The realization settled over him with the same cold certainty as the snow. He was alone in a blizzard miles from shelter, with darkness coming and temperatures still falling. His hands were too numb to feel his fingers. His feet were blocks of ice inside his boots, and the exhaustion pulling at him was the kind that made lying down seem reasonable, made sleep seem like a viable option. Caleb knew what that meant. He'd found frozen bodies before, men who'd sat down to rest and never gotten up again. The cold didn't hurt once you stopped fighting it. It just pulled you down gentle and final, and by the time anyone found you, you were past caring. He forced himself to his feet, swaying, and started walking. He had no idea which direction led to safety, but standing still meant death, so he walked, 1 foot in front of the other, each step requiring conscious thought, deliberate will. The wind pushed at him from all sides, trying to knock him down again. The snow covered his tracks as fast as he made them. Time became meaningless. He might have walked for minutes or hours. His thoughts grew fuzzy, disconnected. He found himself thinking about Eleanor, about how angry she'd be when they found him frozen because he'd been too stubborn to retreat when he should have. She'd probably write a strongly worded critique of his decision-making process, file it properly in her record books, and use it as a cautionary example for future ranch management. The thought made him laugh, or try to. The sound came out as a wheeze that hurt his damaged ribs. He fell again, harder this time. Couldn't get up. The snow was actually warm now, comfortable, inviting him to rest. Just for a minute, just to catch his breath. Caleb closed his eyes against the wind, and darkness rose up to meet him. When Eleanor received word that Caleb had ridden into the storm alone, she felt fear crystallize into something hard and sharp in her chest. "How long ago?" she demanded of the ranch hand who'd brought the message, a young man named Thomas who looked half-frozen himself. "Maybe 2 hours, ma'am. Miguel sent me back to warn you we might need the house for shelter." 2 hours. In conditions like this, 2 hours could be fatal. Eleanor moved to the window, staring out at the white wall of wind and snow that had swallowed the landscape. Somewhere out there, Caleb was alone and in danger, and every minute of delay reduced the chances of finding him alive. "Gather every lantern we have," she ordered, "and every blanket. If the men make it back, they'll need to warm up fast." "Yes, ma'am." Thomas hesitated. "The boss, he's smart about weather. He'll find his way back." Eleanor wanted to believe that. But she'd lived with Caleb Mercer for 3 months now, had watched him work himself past exhaustion day after day, had seen the way he pushed through pain and fatigue because stopping felt like weakness. Smart didn't matter when stubborn overruled survival instinct. She prepared the house systematically, the way she did everything, forcing down panic with practical action. Stoked the fires high, set water boiling for hot drinks, laid out blankets and dry clothes, created stations by each window where someone could watch for movement in the storm. The first men arrived an hour later, frozen and exhausted but alive. Miguel led them, his face gray with cold and worry. "The boss?" Eleanor asked, already knowing the answer from his expression. "He went after stragglers, alone. We got the main herd secured, but—" Miguel stopped, pulled off his ice-crusted hat. He should have been back by now. His horse came in riderless 20 minutes ago. Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, grabbed the back of a chair for support. "We have to find him." "Senora, it's suicide out there. The storm is only getting worse. We'd be riding blind, and we'd probably lose more men trying to—" "I don't care." Eleanor's voice came out sharper than she intended, edged with the fear she was trying to contain. "He's out there because he was trying to save our cattle, our investment, our ranch, and I will not leave him to freeze to death because it's dangerous to look." Miguel studied her for a long moment, seeing past the Eastern manners and formal composure to the steel beneath. "What do you want us to do?" Eleanor's mind raced, sorting through options with the same analytical precision she applied to ranch accounts. Pure searching was futile. They'd never find one man in this storm by chance. They needed a system, a strategy, a way to narrow the search area. "Where did he go after the stragglers?" she asked. "South, toward the open range. He was trying to turn them back to the canyon." "And his horse came from which direction?" Miguel pointed. "Northeast. Came straight to the barn like it knew the way." Eleanor moved to the map of the ranch that she'd drawn and hung in the parlor, studying the terrain features, the likely paths. If Caleb had gone south, and the horse had returned from the northeast, that suggested Caleb had managed to turn the cattle but hadn't made it back with them. "Here," she said, pointing to a section of the map. "Between the south pasture and the canyon approach. That's where he'll be. He turned them, then something went wrong." "That's still 3 square miles in a blizzard," Miguel said gently. "Then we searched 3 square miles." Eleanor turned to face the assembled men, all of them watching her with varying degrees of doubt and respect. "I need volunteers. We'll work in pairs, stay within shouting distance of each other, search in a grid pattern. We have 4 hours of daylight left. We use them. Senora, the risk is acceptable." Eleanor cut him off, her voice brooking no argument. "Mr. Mercer is out there because he was protecting what we've all built together. We find him. That's not a request." For a moment, no one moved. Then Charlie stepped forward, old and weathered and steady. "I'll ride, ma'am. Boss saved my life once. Reckon I owe him." "I'll go," said another hand. "Me too." Within minutes, Eleanor had 6 volunteers, all willing to risk the storm. She organized them into pairs, assigned each team a section of the search grid, made sure they understood the pattern and the signals. "What about you, Senora?" Miguel asked. "You should stay here, coordinate." "I'm riding." Eleanor was already moving toward her room to change into warmer clothes. "I know that terrain as well as anyone, and I'm not sitting here doing nothing while my husband freezes to death." "Senora, Miguel." She stopped, turned to face him directly. "I appreciate your concern, but Caleb is my husband, my partner, and I'm the one who convinced him to be cautious, to think before acting. If he's out there dying because he was trying to prove he could still be strong, that's partially on me. So I'm going." Miguel nodded slowly. "Then I'm riding with you. Someone needs to keep you from doing something the boss would never forgive me for allowing." They rode out 15 minutes later, wrapped in every layer they could wear and still move, faces covered against the wind, horses nervous but obedient. The storm had eased slightly, from impossible to merely brutal, and visibility had improved to maybe 50 feet on a good moment. Eleanor's section was the southeastern quadrant, the area where her calculations suggested Caleb was most likely to be. She and Miguel worked the grid methodically, calling out every few minutes, listening for any response. The wind stole their voices and the snow muffled everything, but they kept going. An hour passed, then another. The light was failing, turning the storm from white to gray to something darker. Eleanor's hands were numb inside her gloves. Her face burned from the cold, and fear was a constant weight in her chest. What if she was wrong? What if he'd gone a different direction? Was lying frozen in some section they weren't searching? What if they were wasting precious time while he died alone and afraid? "Senora, we need to turn back soon," Miguel shouted over the wind. "We can't help him if we freeze too." "5 more minutes," Eleanor called back. "Just 5 more." That's when she saw it. A dark shape in the snow, too regular to be natural. She spurred her horse forward, Miguel close behind, and felt her heart stop when she recognized Caleb's coat. He was lying on his side, half buried in snow, not moving. Eleanor was off her horse before it fully stopped, falling to her knees beside him, pulling snow away from his face with frantic hands. "Caleb!" She shook his shoulder, felt nothing. "Caleb, wake up!" Miguel was beside her, checking for breath, for a pulse, his experienced hands moving quickly. "He's alive. Barely. We need to get him warm immediately." They worked together, wrapping Caleb in blankets, lifting him onto Miguel's horse, with Eleanor holding him upright from behind. He was dead weight, unconscious and frozen, but the faint rise and fall of his chest meant he was still breathing, still fighting. The ride back to the ranch was the longest of Eleanor's life. She held Caleb against her, trying to share what little warmth she had, talking to him constantly, even though he couldn't hear. "Stay with me," she whispered against his ice-crusted hair. "You don't get to die, do you understand? We have too much work to do. I haven't finished organizing your filing system. You still owe me an explanation for the feed purchase from March. You have to stay." At the house, willing hands lifted Caleb down, carried him inside to the fire. Eleanor directed operations with the same systematic precision she used for everything, because falling apart would help no one. "Get his wet clothes off. Warm blankets. Not hot. We need to raise his temperature gradually or we'll shock his system." She was already peeling off her own wet layers, moving to kneel beside Caleb as the men worked. Someone ride for the doctor, and someone else prepare hot water bottles wrapped in cloth so they don't burn. For the next 4 hours, Eleanor fought for her husband's life with the same fierce determination she'd applied to saving his ranch. She monitored his breathing, his color, the slow return of warmth to his extremities. She spooned warm broth between his lips when he was conscious enough to swallow. She changed blankets when they grew damp from melted snow. She didn't sleep, didn't eat, didn't leave his side. The doctor arrived near midnight, examined Caleb with professional thoroughness, and delivered his verdict. Severe hypothermia, possible frostbite to his extremities, bruised or broken ribs on the left side. "He's lucky you found him when you did, Mrs. Mercer. Another hour and we'd be planning a funeral." He packed his bag, preparing to leave. "Keep him warm, keep him hydrated, and don't let him do anything foolish for at least a week. Those ribs need time to heal." "A week?" Eleanor almost laughed at the impossibility of it. "Doctor, you've met my husband. He doesn't understand the concept of rest." "Then it's your job to make him understand. Because if he goes back out in the cold before he's healed, the pneumonia will kill him where the blizzard failed." The doctor's expression softened. "He's a stubborn man, Mrs. Mercer, but I suspect you already knew that." After he left, Eleanor sat beside the bed where Caleb lay unconscious, his face pale against the pillows, his breathing still too shallow for comfort. She took his hand, careful of the fingers that might be frostbitten, and felt the tears she'd been holding back finally break free. "You stupid, brave, impossible man," she whispered. "What were you thinking? 20 cattle aren't worth your life. Nothing is worth your life." But even as she said it, Eleanor knew exactly what Caleb had been thinking. He'd been thinking about responsibility, about protecting what mattered, about refusing to surrender anything else to a world that had already taken so much. He'd been thinking like the man who'd built a ranch from dust and determination, the man who saw retreat as weakness and asking for help as failure, the man she'd somehow, against all logic and intention, fallen in love with. The realization should have shocked her, should have sent her reeling with all its implications. Instead, it settled over her like something she'd known for a while but hadn't been ready to acknowledge. Somewhere between shooting at rustlers and reorganizing filing systems, between harsh words and honest partnership, Eleanor had stopped seeing Caleb as a legal convenience and started seeing him as her husband in truth, and she'd nearly lost him. "You have to wake up," she said, gripping his hand tighter, "because I need to yell at you properly for this, and I can't do that while you're unconscious. And because we made a deal, remember? Partnership. Standing beside each other. You can't do that if you're dead. Caleb's fingers twitched in her grip, so slight she almost missed it. Then his eyes opened, unfocused and confused, searching the ceiling before finding her face. Eleanor? His voice came out rough as gravel, barely audible. I'm here. She leaned closer, relief flooding through her so strong it made her dizzy. Don't try to talk. Just rest. The cattle are fine. The men got them secured, but you nearly died, you stubborn fool. You went into a blizzard alone and almost didn't come back. Eleanor's voice cracked despite her best efforts. Do you have any idea what that would have done? What I would have... She stopped, swallowing hard. Caleb's eyes cleared slightly, focusing on her face with growing awareness. You're crying. I'm angry. You're crying, he repeated, and something shifted in his expression. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. You came after me. Of course I came after you. You're my husband, my partner. Did you think I'd just let you freeze to death out of convenience? Eleanor wiped her face impatiently. I organized a search party, calculated your most likely location, and rode into that storm to find you. And when I did, you were nearly dead because you were too stubborn to turn back when you should have. Had to save the cattle. The cattle aren't worth your life. The words burst out louder than she intended, sharp with fear and fury, and something deeper. Nothing is worth your life, Caleb. Not the land, not the herd, not any of it. Do you understand me? If you die, none of it matters. Caleb stared at her, and Eleanor watched realization dawn in his eyes. Not just understanding of what she was saying, but of what she was revealing in saying it. Eleanor, he said quietly, I'm sorry. You should be. You should be terrified of what I'm going to do to you when you're recovered enough to withstand it. She stood abruptly, needing distance from the intensity of the moment. The doctor says a week of rest minimum. I'll be enforcing that, so don't bother arguing. Wouldn't dream of it. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. You're terrifying when you're managing things. I'm terrifying when my husband nearly dies from stupidity. Eleanor moved toward the door, paused with her hand on the frame. Get some sleep. I'll be back to check on you in an hour. Eleanor? She turned back and the look on Caleb's face made her breath catch. Thank you, he said, for coming after me. For... He paused, searching for words. For caring enough to be angry. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice, and left before she could say something that would change everything between them in ways neither might be ready for. But as she walked to her own room, finally allowing herself the luxury of collapsing into exhausted sleep, she knew it was already too late. The arrangement they'd made, practical, businesslike, carefully bounded, had transformed into something neither had planned for. And tomorrow, when Caleb was stronger and she was calmer, they were going to have to figure out what to do about it. Caleb woke to pale winter sunlight filtering through the bedroom window and the unfamiliar sensation of being warm, dry, and completely trapped beneath what felt like half the blankets in Arizona territory. His ribs screamed protest when he tried to shift position, and his hands throbbed with a deep ache that suggested frostbite had come close but not quite claimed his fingers. He was alive. That realization came with a mixture of relief and embarrassment as fragments of memory returned. The blizzard, the fall, the bone-deep cold that had made lying down seem like wisdom instead of surrender. And then Eleanor's face above him, tear-streaked and furious, telling him nothing was worth his life. The bedroom door opened quietly, and Eleanor herself appeared carrying a tray. She'd changed from her riding clothes into a simple house dress, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, but there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of too little sleep. You're awake, she said, setting the tray on the bedside table. How do you feel? Like I got trampled by the entire herd. Caleb tried to sit up, managed about 3 inches before his ribs convinced him otherwise. How long was I out? 14 hours. It's nearly noon. Eleanor helped him adjust the pillows so he could lean back at an angle that didn't make breathing agony. The doctor said you need at least a week of rest, possibly 2 depending on how your ribs heal. 2 weeks? Eleanor, I can't. You can and you will. Her voice carried the kind of finality that he'd learned meant arguing was pointless. The ranch won't collapse because you spend time recovering. Miguel and I have everything under control. Caleb wanted to protest, wanted to insist he was fine, but the simple act of adjusting position had left him breathless and shaking. He settled for a different objection. You shouldn't have to run the place alone. I'm not alone. I have Miguel, Charlie, and 8 other competent men who actually know how to follow instructions. Eleanor poured water from a pitcher, held the glass where he could reach it. Drink. The doctor says you need to stay hydrated. He drank, grateful for the coolness against his throat. You organized the search party. Of course I did. Someone had to, and you were busy freezing to death. Eleanor's tone was matter-of-fact, but Caleb caught the tremor beneath it. Miguel said the odds of finding you were minimal. I told him we were searching anyway. You could have died out there too. Yes, I could have. Eleanor met his eyes squarely. And I nearly did. We lost visibility 3 times, and Miguel almost rode his horse into a ravine in the dark. It was reckless, dangerous, and completely necessary. Caleb studied her face, seeing past the composed exterior to the fear she'd experienced, the choices she'd made. You came after me anyway. What did you expect me to do? Sit by the fire and hope for the best? Eleanor's composure cracked slightly. You're my husband, Caleb. My partner. You don't leave partners to die alone in the snow. The word husband carried weight that it hadn't before, transformed from legal designation to something more fundamental. Caleb reached for her hand, ignoring the protest from his damaged ribs, and held it gently. Thank you, he said quietly, for not giving up on me. Eleanor's fingers tightened around his, and for a moment they just sat there, connected by touch and shared survival. Then she pulled back, busying herself with the tray. You need to eat. Broth and bread to start. Your stomach won't handle anything heavier yet. She arranged the bowl and plate with precise movements, avoiding his eyes. And then you need to sleep more. Healing requires rest. Over the next 3 days, Caleb learned that Eleanor in nursing mode was somehow more formidable than Eleanor in business mode. She monitored his temperature, checked his breathing, changed bandages on his frostbitten fingers with gentle efficiency, and absolutely refused to let him do anything that required moving from the bed. I need to check the cattle, he argued on the second day. Miguel is checking the cattle. Your job is to heal. Eleanor didn't even look up from the ranch ledgers she was updating at the small desk by the window. The north fence is being repaired by Charlie and Thomas. They're actually quite competent when given clear instructions. Eleanor, I can't just lie here while everyone else... You can, and you will. She set down her pen, fixing him with a look that could have frozen water. Do you know what the doctor said? He said if you develop pneumonia from going back out too soon, you'll likely die. He said your ribs need time to knit properly, or they could puncture a lung. He said you came within an hour of freezing to death, and your body needs time to recover from that trauma. Caleb opened his mouth to argue, saw the fear beneath her stern expression, and closed it again. You're scared. Of course I'm scared. Eleanor's voice dropped to something quieter, more vulnerable. I found you half buried in snow, not breathing properly, so cold I thought we'd lost you. I spent 4 hours fighting to keep you alive while the doctor rode through a blizzard to get here. And now you want to risk it all again because you can't stand being inactive for a few days? The admission silenced him more effectively than any command could have. Eleanor rarely revealed what she was feeling, preferring to keep her emotions carefully controlled in private. Hearing her acknowledge fear, seeing it in the set of her shoulders, made Caleb realize how much his near death had cost her. I'm sorry, he said. I'll rest. I promise. Good. Eleanor returned to her ledgers, but Caleb noticed her hands weren't quite steady as she picked up the pen. By the 4th day, Caleb could sit up without feeling like his ribs were being torn apart, and the deep ache in his hands had faded to something manageable. Eleanor allowed him to move to a chair by the window, wrapped in blankets, where he could at least watch the ranch operations from a distance. What he saw surprised him. Eleanor had transformed the daily routine in his absence, implementing systems he'd never thought to create. She'd posted a schedule in the barn that rotated duties so no one worked the hardest jobs 2 days in a row. She'd reorganized the supply shed with clear labels and inventory tracking. She'd even arranged for the men to take meals in shifts so someone was always available for emergencies. "You've been busy," Caleb said when she brought him lunch. Someone had to be. Eleanor set the tray down, settling into the chair across from him. "Your operation was functional but inefficient. Small changes make significant differences." "It's more than small changes. You've restructured everything." "I've optimized everything," Eleanor corrected gently. "There's a difference. The core of what you built is solid, Caleb. I just made it run smoother." He studied her profile as she looked out the window. This woman who'd arrived on a stage 5 months ago as a stranger and had somehow become essential to everything he valued. She'd saved his accounts, caught his thief, organized his rescue, and was now running his ranch with the same fierce competence she brought to everything. And he'd almost left her to manage it alone because he'd been too stubborn to retreat from a blizzard. "Eleanor," he said carefully, "can we talk about what happened? Really talk about it?" She went very still, her expression carefully neutral. "We don't need to revisit. We do." Caleb leaned forward despite the twinge in his ribs. "You said something when you found me. You said nothing was worth my life. That if I died, none of it mattered." Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. "You were dying. I was upset. You were honest." He waited until she looked at him. "And I need to be honest too. I went after those cattle because I've spent 6 years believing that the ranch was all that mattered. That if I could just hold on to the land, build something that lasted, it would be enough. But when I was out there in the cold, when I thought I might not make it back, all I could think about was you." Her breath caught audibly. "Caleb, let me finish." He reached for her hand, held it despite her obvious urge to pull away. "I thought about how you'd reorganize my funeral the same way you reorganized my files. How you'd probably write a detailed critique of my poor decision-making. How I'd never get to hear you lecture me about proper risk assessment again." He paused, gathering courage. "How I'd never get to tell you that this arrangement we made, this practical, business-like marriage, had stopped feeling practical somewhere along the way." Eleanor stared at him, her gray-blue eyes wide with something between fear and hope. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I fell in love with my wife." The words came out simpler than he'd planned, more direct. "I don't know when it happened. Maybe when you shot at that rustler to protect the breeding stock. Maybe when you caught Tom Bradshaw stealing and didn't flinch. Maybe when you rode into a blizzard because you refused to let me die alone." He tightened his grip on her hand. "But somewhere between the wedding and now, you stopped being a solution to a legal problem and started being the most important thing in my life." Eleanor's composure finally shattered. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and her voice shook when she spoke. "You almost died. I know. You almost left me here alone, and I would have had to figure out how to keep going when the only person who ever treated me like an equal partner was gone." The words tumbled out fast and broken. "I would have had to manage this ranch knowing that the man who trusted me with it, who valued my mind and my judgment, who never once made me feel like I was less because I was a woman, I would have lost you before I ever got to tell you that I love you too." The admission hung between them, raw and honest and transformative. Caleb pulled her closer, ignoring the protest from his ribs, and Eleanor came willingly, carefully avoiding his injuries as she leaned into his embrace. "I love you," she whispered against his shoulder. "I've loved you for weeks, maybe months, and I was too afraid to say it. Too afraid you'd think I was changing the terms of our agreement, demanding something you never promised to give." "Eleanor." Caleb tilted her face up so he could see her properly. "I promised you honesty, dignity, and partnership. Loving you doesn't change those promises. It just makes them mean more." He kissed her then, gentle and careful, and felt her hands come up to frame his face with a tenderness that made his chest ache for reasons that had nothing to do with broken ribs. When they separated, Eleanor was smiling through her tears, and Caleb thought he'd never seen anything more beautiful. "The doctor said no strenuous activity," she murmured, but there was laughter in her voice. "Pretty sure kissing my wife doesn't count as strenuous." "Your wife?" Eleanor tested the words, and they sounded different now, weighted with emotion instead of legal obligation. "I like the sound of that." Over the following week, as Caleb continued to heal and Eleanor continued to manage the ranch with systematic precision, Something fundamental shifted in how they moved through the world together. The careful boundaries they'd maintained dissolved, replaced by casual touches, shared glances, and the easy intimacy of people who'd chosen each other twice, once out of necessity, once out of love. Caleb moved back into the master bedroom properly, no longer sleeping on the floor but sharing the bed with Eleanor curled against his uninjured side. They'd talk for hours in the dark, sharing stories about their lives before, their hopes for what came next, the small revelations that came with actually knowing someone instead of just living beside them. Eleanor told him about her mother, who died when she was 12, and how she'd learned bookkeeping because her grieving father needed help he was too proud to ask for. She told him about discovering Aldridge's theft and feeling her entire understanding of trust shatter in an instant. Caleb told her about the first year on the ranch, when he'd lived in a tent and eaten nothing but beans and hardtack for 6 months straight because every penny went back into the land. He told her about the Apache raid that had killed his nearest neighbor and how he'd hidden in a root cellar for 3 days, terrified and ashamed of his fear. "You survived," Eleanor said, running her fingers through his hair in the darkness. "That's not shameful. That's wisdom." Didn't feel wise at the time. Bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it. She shifted closer, careful of his healing ribs. "You've been brave every day since you started this place. You just needed someone to tell you that surviving counts as success, too." By the end of the second week, Caleb was moving around the house without pain, and the doctor pronounced him healed enough for light work. Eleanor immediately implemented a schedule that limited his hours and forbade him from doing anything that involved climbing, heavy lifting, or exposure to extreme cold. "I'm not made of glass," Caleb protested when she handed him the written schedule. "No, you're made of stubborn determination and poor self-preservation instincts." Eleanor didn't look up from her ledgers, which is why you need external regulation. Miguel, who'd been listening from the doorway, laughed outright. "I like her more every day, boss. She's the only person who can make you listen to reason." "That's because she's terrifying," Caleb muttered, but he was smiling. "I prefer the term effective." Eleanor finally looked up, and the warmth in her eyes softened the stern words. "Now go check the south fence like your schedule says, but be back by 3 for your afternoon rest." "Yes, ma'am." Caleb crossed to her chair, bent to kiss the top of her head in a gesture that had become habitual. "Anything else, boss?" "Don't call me boss. We're partners, remember?" But she was smiling as she said it. The partnership she'd insisted on from the beginning had transformed into something richer, more complex. They were still business partners, still managing the ranch together with Eleanor's systems and Caleb's instincts. But now they were also lovers, friends, the kind of married couple who could argue about cattle feed prices in the morning and fall asleep wrapped around each other at night. It was everything Caleb had never known to want, and it had come from the most unlikely source, a desperate advertisement and a woman brave enough to answer it. The trouble came on a cold morning in late February, when a rider arrived from town carrying an official-looking envelope sealed with the territorial government's mark. Caleb took it with growing dread, remembering the last time he'd received official correspondence and how it had nearly cost him everything. Eleanor was in the barn doing inventory when he found her, the opened letter in his hand and his expression grim enough that she immediately set down her clipboard. "What is it?" she asked. "It's from the Territorial Land Office. They're challenging our claim." Caleb handed her the letter, watched her face as she read quickly, her expression growing harder with each line. "On what grounds?" she demanded. "You met their requirements. We have a legal marriage, documented and filed. They're saying the marriage was fraudulent, entered into solely to circumvent the intent of the homestead law." Caleb's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "Someone filed a complaint claiming we don't have a real marriage, that it's just a legal convenience." Eleanor's eyes flashed dangerously. "Someone? Do they name the complainant?" "Anonymous tip, apparently, but it's enough to trigger an investigation." Caleb took the letter back, crumpling it in his fist. "They're sending an inspector in 2 weeks to evaluate whether our marriage is genuine or fraudulent. If they decide it's fraudulent, we lose everything." The implications settled over them both like a weight. Everything they'd built, everything they'd fought for, everything they'd become to each other, all of it could be stripped away because some unknown enemy had decided to weaponize bureaucracy against them. "This is Hendricks," Eleanor said with icy certainty. "The supplier you stopped using. He lost significant income when we switched to Silver City, and he's exactly petty enough to retaliate this way." "Can we prove it?" "Probably not. Anonymous complaints are designed to protect the complainant." Eleanor began pacing, her mind visibly working through the problem. "But we can prepare for the inspection. We can demonstrate that our marriage is real, genuine, not just a paper arrangement." Caleb watched her pace, saw her slipping into the analytical mode that had saved his ranch more than once. But this time, analysis wasn't enough. This time they were being asked to prove something that couldn't be documented in ledgers or demonstrated through efficient systems. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "how do we prove we love each other?" She stopped pacing, turned to face him. "I don't know. How does anyone prove that?" It was a genuine question, and Caleb had no good answer. Love wasn't something you could quantify or document. It lived in small moments, in shared glances and private jokes, in the way Eleanor's hand fit perfectly in his and how she knew exactly how he took his coffee. It was the terror he'd felt at the thought of losing her, the way she'd ridden into a blizzard to save him, the quiet certainty that he'd rather face any hardship with her than face success alone. "But how did you prove that to a government inspector?" "We'll figure it out," Eleanor said, moving to take his hands. "We've faced rustlers, blizzards, and thieves. We can face this too." "This is different." Caleb pulled her closer, needing the contact. "This attacks the foundation of everything. They're saying what we have isn't real. Then we show them how wrong they are." Eleanor's voice carried absolute conviction. "We show them a partnership built on respect, trust, and love. We show them a ranch that runs better because we run it together. We show them that what started as practical necessity became something neither of us expected, but both of us choose every single day." Caleb rested his forehead against hers, drawing strength from her certainty. "What if it's not enough?" "Then we fight harder." Eleanor's hands tightened on his. "I didn't cross a continent, reorganize your entire operation, and save your life in a blizzard to lose you now to some bureaucrat's interpretation of marriage. We're going to win this, Caleb, because losing isn't an option." Her fierce determination sparked something in Caleb's chest, pushing back the fear and defeat. She was right. They'd fought too hard, built too much, become too essential to each other to let someone take it away without a fight. "All right," he said. "We fight. Together." "Together," Eleanor agreed and sealed it with a kiss that tasted like promise and defiance. Over the next 2 weeks, they prepared for the inspection with the same systematic approach Eleanor brought to everything. They organized their financial records to show integrated management and shared decision-making. They had Miguel and the ranch hands prepared to testify to the genuine nature of their relationship. They documented improvements made since the marriage, demonstrating active partnership rather than passive coexistence. But more than that, they simply continued being themselves, working side by side, arguing over cattle breeding strategies, laughing over dinner, falling into bed exhausted and content. They didn't perform marriage for the benefit of some future investigation. They just lived it, day by day, choice by choice, until the genuine affection between them was as obvious as the Arizona sun. The inspector arrived on a Thursday, a thin man named Wilson, who carried himself with the officious air of someone who enjoyed wielding small amounts of power. He examined their records, interviewed the ranch hands, observed their interactions with the skeptical eye of someone determined to find fraud. Eleanor met his scrutiny with calm dignity, answering every question with precision while never betraying the fear Caleb knew she felt. Caleb himself remained steady, honest, letting the truth of what they'd built speak for itself. On the second day, Wilson sat them both down in the parlor, his expression unreadable. "I've completed my evaluation," he said, consulting his notes, "and I have to say, this is one of the more unusual cases I've investigated." Caleb felt Eleanor's hand find his beneath the table, her fingers cold but steady. "The complaint alleged that your marriage was fraudulent, entered into solely to meet homestead requirements," Wilson continued. "The evidence for this allegation is actually quite compelling. You married within weeks of the deadline, had no prior courtship, and openly discussed the practical nature of the arrangement." "But," Eleanor started. Wilson held up a hand. "However, evidence of fraud requires more than suspicious circumstances. It requires proof that the marriage is not genuine, that you maintain separate lives, that there is no actual partnership or commitment. He set down his notes, looking at them both directly. And that evidence simply doesn't exist here. Caleb felt hope flicker cautiously to life. Your financial records show completely integrated management, Wilson said. Your employees uniformly describe a genuine partnership characterized by mutual respect and affection. Your home shows every sign of being shared space, not separate territories. And frankly, the way you look at each other when you think no one is watching doesn't suggest fraud. It suggests a successful marriage. Eleanor's grip on Caleb's hand tightened almost painfully. So I'm dismissing the complaint as unfounded and recommending your homestead claim be permanently secured. Wilson stood, extending his hand. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Mercer. The ranch is yours. The relief was so intense that Caleb felt momentarily dizzy. Eleanor made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob, and they both stood to shake Wilson's hand, their own hands still joined. After the inspector left, they stood in the parlor in stunned silence, the weight of months of fear finally lifting. We won, Eleanor said, as if testing the reality of it. We won, Caleb confirmed, and then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her tight, enough that his still-healing ribs protested faintly. We actually won. Eleanor laughed, the sound bright and free, and kissed him with a joy that made everything they'd fought through worthwhile. When they finally separated, her eyes were shining with tears that had nothing to do with sorrow. What do we do now? She asked. Caleb considered the question, thought about all the possibilities that stretched before them now that the ranch was truly, permanently theirs. Now that they had time to build instead of just survive, to grow instead of just hold on. We keep going, he said simply. We run this ranch together. We make it better. We build something that lasts. He cupped her face gently. And we do it as partners, as husband and wife, as people who chose each other even when we didn't have to. Eleanor smiled, radiant and certain. I like that plan. That night they celebrated with the ranch hands, sharing the news and the relief that came with permanent security. Miguel raised a toast to the boss and his terrifying wife, which got laughs all around, and an arch look from Eleanor that only made them laugh harder. Later, alone in their bedroom with the lamp burning low and the desert night quiet around them, Caleb held Eleanor close and thought about the journey that had brought them here. From a desperate advertisement to a forced marriage to a partnership that had transformed into love. It hadn't been the path either of them planned, but it had led them exactly where they needed to be. Thank you, he said into the darkness. For what? Eleanor's voice was drowsy, content. For answering that ad. For taking a chance on a desperate rancher who didn't know what he needed. Caleb pressed a kiss to her temple. For being brave enough to choose this. Eleanor shifted to look at him, her eyes serious in the lamplight. We chose each other, Caleb. That's what makes it real. Not the certificate, not the government's approval. The choice to stay, to build, to love, even when it's hard. She was right, of course. She usually was. And as Caleb drifted toward sleep with his wife in his arms and their future finally secure, he thought about how strange and wonderful it was that the best things in life sometimes came from the most desperate moments. All you had to do was be brave enough to choose them. Spring arrived in the Arizona territory with unexpected gentleness, transforming the harsh landscape into something almost tender. Wildflowers appeared in impossible places, defiant splashes of color against the scrubland. The cattle grew sleek and healthy on new grass, and the ranch that had teetered on the edge of failure just months ago hummed with the quiet confidence of prosperity. Eleanor stood on the porch in the early morning light, watching the sun paint the distant mountains in shades of rose and gold. Behind her, she could hear Caleb moving through the house, the familiar sounds of him making coffee and checking the day's work schedule that she'd posted the night before. 6 months into their marriage, their real marriage, not just the legal arrangement they'd started with, and these morning rhythms had become as natural as breathing. You're up early, Caleb said, emerging with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one, then settled beside her on the porch rail, their shoulders touching in easy contact. Couldn't sleep. Eleanor took a sip, savoring the warmth. I kept thinking about the Henderson proposal, The Henderson Ranch bordered their property to the west, 500 acres of prime grazing land that old Marcus Henderson had finally decided to sell. He'd approached them 2 weeks ago with an offer. First rights to purchase at a fair price, in recognition of how they'd helped him track down rustlers the previous fall. "You're worried about overextending," Caleb said, reading her concern with the accuracy that came from months of learning each other's thoughts. "I'm worried about risking everything we've built on expansion we might not be ready for." Eleanor turned to face him. "The numbers work, barely, but it would drain our reserves and leave us vulnerable if we hit a bad year. So we don't do it." Caleb's response was simple, unconcerned. "We've got a good operation now. We don't need to grow just because we can." Eleanor studied his face, seeing the change that had come over him in recent months. The desperate edge was gone, replaced by something steadier, more grounded. He no longer measured success solely by how much land he controlled, or how large his herd grew. He'd learned to value sustainability over expansion, partnership over independence. "But you want to do it," she said. "I can see it in your eyes when you talk about those western pastures. The water access alone would solve half our summer grazing problems." Caleb smiled, caught. "I want a lot of things. Doesn't mean they're all smart decisions." He set down his coffee, taking her hand. "What do you think we should do?" The question still sent warmth through Eleanor's chest, even after months of hearing it. Caleb had learned to genuinely value her judgment, to seek her counsel not out of obligation but because he trusted her perspective. They'd become true partners in every sense, their different strengths complementing rather than competing. "I think we could make it work," Eleanor said slowly, organizing her thoughts. "But only if we're smart about it. We'd need to negotiate better terms, maybe payment over time instead of all at once. We'd need to hire 2 more hands, but only after we've secured the purchase. And we'd need to be absolutely ruthless about expenses for the next year." "Ruthless, huh?" Caleb grinned. "Good thing I married someone who excels at that." "You married someone who excels at not letting you bankrupt yourself through enthusiasm." But Eleanor was smiling too. "I'll draw up a detailed proposal. If the numbers work with extended payment terms, we approach Henderson. If they don't, we walk away and revisit in a year. See? This is why you're the smart one." Caleb leaned in to kiss her, coffee-flavored and warm. "I'd have just said yes and figured it out later." "I know. It's terrifying." Eleanor kissed him back, then pulled away before they could get distracted. "Go check the north fence. I'll work on the Henderson analysis." The day passed in the familiar rhythm of ranch work. Caleb rode out with Miguel to inspect fence lines and check on the herd's movement to summer pasture. Eleanor spent the morning with the account books, running numbers and projecting scenarios, her methodical mind working through possibilities and probabilities. By afternoon, she had her answer. The Henderson purchase could work, but only with specific conditions that would require careful negotiation. She was organizing her notes when she heard raised voices from the yard. Not angry, but excited, urgent. Eleanor moved to the window and saw a wagon approaching, dust rising behind it in golden clouds. As it drew closer, she recognized Sarah Chen from town, but the wagon was loaded with something large covered by canvas, and Sarah was waving enthusiastically. "Eleanor!" Sarah called as the wagon pulled up. "Is Caleb here? I've got something for you both." Caleb emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his work pants, curiosity evident on his face. Eleanor joined him in the yard, intrigued despite herself. "What's all this?" Caleb asked, gesturing to the covered cargo. Sarah's face lit up with barely contained excitement. "A wedding present. Very, very late, but I think you'll forgive the delay." She began untying the canvas. "Remember how I mentioned my cousin runs a furniture workshop in San Francisco? Well, I wrote to him about you two, and he insisted on making something special." The canvas fell away, revealing a beautiful oak dining table, its surface polished to a warm glow, along with 8 matching chairs carved with subtle, elegant details. Eleanor felt her breath catch. The table was gorgeous, far finer than anything they currently owned, and clearly represented weeks of skilled craftsmanship. "Sarah, we can't accept this," she said, even as her fingers reached out to touch the smooth wood. "It's too much." "It's a gift, and you're accepting it." Sarah's tone brooked no argument. "You two have helped everyone in this valley over the past months. You caught the rustlers that were plaguing half the ranches. You organized the winter supply cooperative that saved 3 families from bankruptcy. Eleanor, you've personally helped 4 different ranchers reorganize their accounts and stop bleeding money to dishonest suppliers. She smiled warmly. This community wants to give something back. Let us. Caleb looked at Eleanor, saw the emotion in her eyes, and made the decision for both of them. Thank you, Sarah. It's beautiful. Please thank your cousin for us. As they unloaded the table with help from the ranch hands, Eleanor felt something shift in her understanding of what they'd built. It wasn't just the ranch itself, the land and cattle and improved infrastructure. It was the connections they'd forged, the reputation they'd earned through honest dealing and community support. They'd become part of something larger than themselves. That evening, they ate dinner at their new table for the first time, just the 2 of them, the lamplight casting warm shadows across the polished wood. Eleanor had made roast chicken, and Caleb had contributed biscuits that were only slightly burned on the bottom. We should have people over, Eleanor said, running her hand along the table's edge. This is meant for gathering, for community. We've been so focused on work that we haven't made time for that. You want to throw a party? Caleb looked amused. The woman who told me she valued privacy and quiet. I've learned some things too. Eleanor met his eyes across the table. I've learned that building something lasting isn't just about financial stability or efficient operations. It's about connection, about being part of something bigger than our individual survival. Caleb reached across the table, taking her hand. You've changed, you know, from the woman who stepped off that stage. So have you, from the desperate man who placed that advertisement. Eleanor smiled. We've changed each other. That's what partnership does. The party happened 2 weeks later, a spring gathering that brought together neighboring ranchers, townspeople, and everyone who'd become part of their extended community. The new table proved its worth, laden with food that people had brought to share. The yard filled with conversation and laughter, children running between adults, the kind of casual warmth that came from genuine friendship rather than obligation. Eleanor found herself standing with a group of ranchers' wives, listening to Martha Crenshaw complain about her husband's stubborn refusal to track expenses properly. He just stuffs receipts in a drawer and hopes for the best, Martha said, exasperated. I swear he has no idea if we're making money or losing it. You should implement a basic ledger system, Eleanor suggested. Nothing complicated, just daily income and expenses tracked by category. I could show you how to set it up if you'd like. Would you? Martha's relief was palpable. I've been trying to manage it myself, but I don't have your head for numbers. Anyone can learn basic bookkeeping, it just requires the right system. Eleanor found herself warming to the topic, explaining simple organizational principles that could transform chaotic finances into clear understanding. By the time the conversation ended, she'd agreed to hold a workshop for anyone interested in learning better ranch management practices. The idea excited her more than she'd expected. The prospect of sharing knowledge, of helping others avoid the mistakes that had nearly destroyed Caleb's operation. Later, as the party wound down and guests began departing, Caleb pulled Eleanor aside. You were glowing during that conversation with Martha, he said. I haven't seen you that animated in weeks. I was thinking about starting something, Eleanor admitted. Regular workshops on ranch management, basic accounting, efficiency improvements. There's so much knowledge that could be shared if someone just organized it properly. You want to teach? Caleb looked delighted rather than concerned. Eleanor, that's brilliant. You could transform operations across the entire valley. It would take time away from the ranch. The ranch can spare you a few hours a week, especially if it means building stronger relationships with our neighbors and establishing you as an expert in the field. Caleb's enthusiasm was infectious. This could be important, Eleanor, not just for others, but for you. She realized he was right. The ranch would always be their foundation, but she'd been feeling the pull toward something more, toward using her skills in ways that extended beyond their property lines. Teaching felt like a natural evolution, a way to make a broader impact while still supporting the community they'd become part of. I'll think about it, she said, but they both knew she'd already decided. The Henderson negotiation concluded successfully in early June. Eleanor's careful analysis and firm bargaining secured extended payment terms that left their reserves intact while giving them access to the additional grazing land. The expansion was cautious, controlled, exactly the kind of strategic growth that positioned them for long-term success rather than risky speculation. On the day they signed the papers, Eleanor and Caleb rode out to survey their enlarged holdings. The sun was setting, painting the landscape in shades of amber and crimson, and the land stretched out before them in all its harsh, beautiful immensity. 900 acres, Caleb said, wonder in his voice. When I started, I had 40 acres and a tent. Now we have this. We have this, Eleanor corrected gently. It was never just you, Caleb. Not from the moment I arrived. He turned to her. This woman who'd transformed his desperate situation into something resembling prosperity, who'd saved his life and reorganized his entire operation and somehow become the center of everything that mattered. The evening light caught in her dark hair, and her eyes held that sharp intelligence that had first drawn his attention, tempered now with affection and trust. I never thanked you properly, he said, for answering that advertisement, for taking a chance on a stranger. You thank me every day. Eleanor moved her horse closer to his, their legs nearly touching. Every time you ask my opinion instead of making decisions alone. Every time you trust me with something important. Every time you choose partnership over pride. I choose you, Caleb said simply. Every day. Every way that matters. They sat there in the fading light, two people who'd found each other through desperation and built something extraordinary through trust, until the stars began emerging in the darkening sky, and it was time to ride home. Eleanor's first workshop drew 12 participants, a mix of ranchers and their wives, all eager to learn better management practices. She taught them basic bookkeeping, inventory tracking, how to identify and eliminate financial waste. The success led to a second workshop, then a third, until she was holding regular sessions that people traveled from neighboring counties to attend. Word spread about the Eastern woman who'd transformed Caleb Mercer's struggling ranch into a model of efficiency, and Eleanor found herself in demand as a consultant. She was careful to balance this new role with ranch responsibilities, but Caleb actively encouraged her expansion, proud of her growing reputation and the respect she commanded. You're becoming famous, he teased one evening, watching her prepare materials for the next day's workshop. The legendary Eleanor Mercer, tamer of chaos and destroyer of inefficiency. I'm helping people avoid mistakes, Eleanor corrected, but she was smiling. There's nothing legendary about teaching basic organizational skills. There is when you do it as well as you do. Caleb moved behind her chair, resting his hands on her shoulders. I'm proud of you, of what you're building beyond the ranch. Eleanor leaned back against him, savoring the contact. I couldn't do it without your support. A lot of husbands wouldn't want their wives spending time on work outside the home. A lot of husbands are fools. Caleb pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Besides, I like that you're too busy teaching to micromanage my fence repair techniques. Your fence repair techniques are adequate at best, and you know it. But Eleanor was laughing, the sound light and free. Summer deepened into the kind of heat that made work possible only in early morning and late evening. The ranch thrived, the expanded grazing land supporting a larger herd without overextending resources. They'd hired 2 new hands as planned, good men who fit well with the existing crew and appreciated Eleanor's systematic approach to operations. Miguel pulled Caleb aside one afternoon, his expression thoughtful. You know, boss, when you first told me you were marrying some stranger from Philadelphia, I thought you'd lost your mind, the foreman said. I was sure it would be a disaster. And now? Caleb asked, amused. Now I think it's the smartest thing you ever did. Miguel grinned. That woman is the best thing that ever happened to this ranch. And to you. I know. Caleb watched Eleanor through the barn door, saw her explaining something to Charlie with patient precision. I think I knew it from the first week when she caught Tom stealing. I just wasn't ready to admit it yet. Love's funny that way, sneaks up on you when you're looking the other direction. Miguel clapped him on the shoulder. You did good, boss. Real good. In August, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. The realization came gradually, a collection of small signs that she initially dismissed before their cumulative weight became undeniable. When the doctor confirmed it, Eleanor felt a complicated rush of emotions, joy, fear, wonder, and an unexpected protectiveness for the life growing inside her. She told Caleb that evening after dinner when they were sitting on the porch watching the last light fade from the sky. She'd planned what to say, how to phrase it, but in the moment, all her careful words disappeared. "I'm pregnant," she said simply. Caleb went very still, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth. We're... He set down the cup carefully, as if afraid sudden movement might shatter the moment. "Eleanor, are you sure?" "The doctor confirmed it this afternoon. I'm about 2 months along." Eleanor watched his face, trying to read his reaction. "I know we never discussed children, never planned for this." Caleb pulled her into his arms so suddenly that she gasped, but his hold was gentle despite the fierceness of his emotion. "We're having a baby," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "Eleanor, we're having a baby." The joy in his voice dissolved her fear, and Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. "You're happy about this?" "Happy?" Caleb pulled back enough to see her face, and his own was bright with wonder. "I'm terrified and thrilled, and I can't believe—" He stopped, laughed, kissed her soundly. "Yes, I'm happy. So incredibly happy." They sat there as darkness fell completely, planning and dreaming, talking about the future in ways they never had before. A child would change everything, would transform their partnership into a family, would require adjustments to work and responsibilities, and the careful balance they'd achieved. But underneath the practical considerations was pure joy, the kind that came from building something lasting not just in land and cattle, but in life itself. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall. Eleanor continued her workshops until the travel became too uncomfortable, then shifted to holding consultation sessions at the ranch. Caleb became almost comically protective, insisting she avoid anything remotely strenuous, while simultaneously trying not to mother her into rebellion. "I'm pregnant, not fragile," Eleanor said for the 10th time, finding Caleb hovering as she reached for a book on a high shelf. "I know, Caleb grabbed the book for her, looking sheepish. "I can't help it. Every time I think about something happening to you or the baby, nothing is going to happen. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." Eleanor softened her tone, taking his hand. "But I appreciate the concern, even when it's excessive." "I'll try to be less excessive." "You won't succeed, but I appreciate the effort." Eleanor kissed him, then settled into her chair with the book. "Now go do something productive instead of watching me read." As her pregnancy advanced, Eleanor found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them here. A year ago, she'd been a stranger stepping off a stage, answering a desperate advertisement with no idea what she was walking into. She'd expected a business arrangement, a practical solution to mutual problems. Instead, she'd found partnership, purpose, and a love that had grown from honesty rather than romance, from shared struggle rather than easy affection. She'd found a home in the unlikeliest place, with a man she'd chosen twice, once out of necessity, once out of devotion. The baby arrived in early March, during a gentle spring rain that felt like blessing. The birth was difficult but not dangerous, and when the midwife finally placed a squalling infant in Eleanor's arms, she felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. "A girl," the midwife announced, "healthy and strong-lunged." Caleb, who'd spent the last 6 hours pacing the hallway in controlled panic, appeared in the doorway with an expression of such raw hope that Eleanor felt tears rise. "Come meet your daughter," she said softly. He crossed the room like he was approaching something sacred, his hands shaking slightly as he looked down at the tiny face framed by wisps of dark hair. "She's perfect," he whispered. "Eleanor, she's absolutely perfect." "What should we name her?" Eleanor asked, though she already had an idea. "I was thinking—" Caleb paused, smiled. "Sarah, after the friend who gave us the table, who welcomed you to town when you first arrived, if that's all right with you." "Sarah Mercer." Eleanor tested the name, found it fit. "I like it. Sarah it is." The baby, Sarah, transformed their lives in ways both expected and surprising. The ranch continued to run efficiently thanks to Eleanor's systems and Miguel's steady management, but the focus shifted. Success was no longer measured solely in acres or cattle or profit margins, but in the sound of Sarah's laughter, in watching Caleb rock her to sleep with infinite patience, in the way their little family grew and adapted to accommodate new life. Eleanor's workshops resumed when Sarah was 3 months old, with the baby in a basket beside her as she taught. The other women cooed over Sarah between lessons on inventory management, and Eleanor discovered that motherhood hadn't diminished her professional credibility. If anything, her ability to balance family and business enhanced her reputation as someone who understood the complete reality of ranch life. By Sarah's first birthday, the ranch had become everything Caleb had once desperately fought to preserve, and more than he'd ever imagined it could be. The operation was profitable, efficient, respected throughout the territory. But more importantly, it was home, a place where love had grown from practicality, where partnership had evolved into family, where two people who'd started as strangers had built something that would outlast them both. On a warm spring evening, with Sarah asleep in her crib and the ranch quiet around them, Eleanor and Caleb sat on their porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Do you ever think about that advertisement?" Eleanor asked, leaning against Caleb's shoulder. "About how different our lives would be if I hadn't answered it?" "All the time." Caleb wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "I think about how desperate I was, how certain I was going to lose everything, how I saw you as a solution to a legal problem instead of a person. To be fair, I saw you the same way, a means of escape, a practical arrangement." Eleanor smiled in the darkness. "We were both wrong about what we were getting into." "Best mistake I ever made." Caleb pressed a kiss to her temple. "Marrying you for the wrong reasons led to loving you for all the right ones." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through sage. Inside, Sarah stirred in her sleep but didn't wake, and Eleanor felt the weight of contentment settle over her like a warm blanket. This was what they'd built from desperation and determination, a partnership that had become a marriage that had become a family that had created a legacy, not just in land or livestock, but in the kind of love that came from choosing each other every day, from facing hardship together and emerging stronger for it. Years would pass. The ranch would continue to grow, Sarah would be joined by 2 more children, Eleanor's consulting business would expand beyond the territory, and Caleb would finally learn to delegate instead of trying to control everything himself. They would face droughts and market crashes, illness and loss, all the challenges that came with building a life in an unforgiving landscape. But they would face them together as partners who'd learned that strength wasn't standing alone, but standing beside someone who chose you every day. As a husband and wife who'd discovered that the best love stories didn't begin with romance but with honesty, didn't rely on passion but on partnership, didn't end with a wedding but truly began there. Caleb Mercer had placed an advertisement seeking a wife to save his ranch. Eleanor Graves had answered seeking escape from a past that threatened to trap her. What they'd found instead was each other, and in finding each other, they'd discovered everything worth fighting for: dignity, purpose, belonging, and a love that grew stronger precisely because it had been earned rather than assumed, built deliberately rather than fallen into, chosen consciously every single day. The ranch spread out around them in the darkness, 400 acres that had become 900, that would someday be passed to children who'd never know how close it came to being lost. The house stood solid behind them, filled now with the sounds of family instead of echoing with loneliness. And on the porch, where Caleb had once stood alone and desperate, 2 people who'd saved each other sat together, watching the stars wheel overhead, grateful for answered prayers neither had known how to voice, and for the unexpected grace that had turned a practical arrangement into the foundation of everything that mattered. Eleanor's hand found Caleb's in the darkness, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of years rather than months. "I love you," she said quietly. "Not because I have to, because I choose to." "I love you too," Caleb replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Best choice I ever made was placing that advertisement. Second best was being brave enough to choose you twice." In the distance, the first stars of evening gave way to the full glory of the Arizona night sky, vast and beautiful and filled with infinite possibility. And beneath that canopy of light, a family that had been born from desperation and necessity settled into the quiet confidence of knowing they'd built something that would last, not because it was easy, but because they'd chosen each other when it was hard, and kept choosing each other every day after. The ranch was secure, The future was bright. And two people who'd started as strangers had become everything to each other, proving that sometimes the best love stories are the ones that begin with honesty, grow through partnership, and endure because both people wake up every morning and choose each other all over again. That was the real legacy. Not the land or the cattle or the prosperity, but the choice to love deliberately, to build consciously, to create together something neither could have achieved alone. And as Eleanor leaned her head on Caleb's shoulder and Sarah slept peacefully in the house they'd made a home, that legacy felt like enough. More than enough. It felt like everything.